The streets of Louisiana in the early years of the 20th century carried with them a particular silence once the sun went down. Gas lamps flickered dimly along the roads, their faint glow swallowed by the thick southern night. Wooden houses creaked in the humid air, shutters drawn tight, as if to keep something out. Neighbors whispered across fences about shadows that moved too quickly, footsteps that echoed when no one seemed to be there, and a figure that stalked the city with a weapon made for splitting wood. They called him simply the Axeman. He was more than a man, or at least that is how he appeared in the terrified imagination of those who lived through his reign of fear. A figure said to vanish into the dark, strike down sleeping families, and leave behind scenes of such violence that even hardened policemen struggled to put words to what they saw. Yet there was another rumor, darker still, one that rippled quietly through immigrant communities and church pews alike. Some believed the Axeman was not working alone. That behind his bloody trail stood a hidden society, a cult that whispered prayers to forces long buried beneath Louisiana's veneer of Catholic devotion and Creole charm. In the year 1911, Louisiana was not just a place of gumbo, jazz, and festivals. It was a crucible of cultures: Italian immigrants, African traditions, Cajun folklore, and old European superstitions all colliding in one small, volatile world. Out of this mix, people began to weave explanations for the murders they could not comprehend. Why were certain families targeted? Why did the killer seem to vanish as if he knew the city better than anyone? And why were his crimes marked by strange consistencies, details that seemed less like accidents of violence and more like ritual? The story begins with the silence before an axe fall. A family asleep in their modest wooden home, lulled by the rhythm of the swamp crickets and the faint wail of a train in the distance. Then impact. A sound like wood splitting, only it is not wood but bone. Neighbors awaken to screams, to the frantic barking of dogs, to the thud of footsteps rushing into the night. By the time anyone dares to step outside, the darkness has already swallowed the figure, leaving behind only a door forced open and the carnage of another household struck down without mercy. It is easy to speak of monsters as if they exist outside of us, as if they are creatures that can be identified, named, and caught. But the Axeman was different. He was both everywhere and nowhere. Some witnesses swore he was impossibly tall, a shadow with long arms and eyes that glinted in the lamplight. Others described an ordinary man in work clothes, someone who could have blended into the crowd at a market or slipped into a pew at Sunday Mass. And then there were those who said he was not a man at all, but a servant, an instrument of a hidden hand. The idea of a cult connection may sound sensational to us now, yet in 1911 it was not so easily dismissed. Louisiana was alive with belief in the unseen. Catholic saints shared space with hoodoo charms tucked into pockets. Prayers for protection mingled with whispered warnings of curses. People spoke of secret lodges, of societies that gathered in basements and back rooms to honor strange symbols, some imported from the old world, others grown from the soil of the new. To frightened families, the murders bore the marks of something beyond human greed or madness. They felt orchestrated, as if carried out with a purpose. And so, when the newspapers carried stories of yet another family felled by the blade, the whispers grew louder. Some said the victims had refused to pay for protection to shadowy figures who visited their stores. Others claimed the Axeman sought offerings, sacrifices to an invisible master. Letters even began to circulate, anonymous notes that suggested the killer was tied to a force demanding recognition, an echo of secret orders and hidden cults. Whether these letters were real or the invention of a fevered press hardly mattered. What mattered was the atmosphere they created, a Louisiana where every creak of a floorboard might mean someone was already inside. Every knock at the door could precede disaster. The Axeman's legend is not just the story of blood and steel. It is the story of fear itself, of how ordinary people tried to shape meaning from chaos. In the absence of answers, they reached for the supernatural, for the ritual, for the ancient and the forbidden. They imagined the killer as part of a cult because the alternative, that violence might be random, motiveless, and senseless, was even more terrifying. And in this way, the Axeman became more than a criminal. He became a myth, a whispered presence that blurred the line between man and specter. Tonight, we walk back into that world. We will trace the shadows of Louisiana in 1911, where superstition and suspicion entwined with genuine horror. We will examine the possibility of a cult connection, the strange ways society tried to explain the unexplainable, and the lingering questions that haunt the case to this day. And as we descend deeper into the silence, into the footsteps that echo when no one should be there, we must ask ourselves, was the Axeman truly just one man with an axe? Or was he part of something far more sinister, something that thrived on the very fear he inspired? Louisiana in the early 1900s was a place of contradictions. It was a land where music blossomed in the form of jazz, born from African rhythms and European harmonies, yet also a place where violence simmered beneath the surface. Its streets rang with laughter and brass bands, but its back alleys carried whispers of crime, suspicion, and blood. To understand the Axeman's story and why some believed he was tied to a cult, we must first step into this world, a world where poverty, prejudice, superstition, and social transformation all collided. New Orleans. The city most closely linked to the legend was unlike any other American city. It was shaped by centuries of colonial influence. French, Spanish, and later American control had left their marks not only in the architecture but in the psyche of its people. Walk through its French Quarter and you would hear a chorus of languages. Italian shopkeepers selling produce from open stalls, Irish dockworkers shouting over crates of cotton, African American women carrying baskets of herbs and remedies rooted in West African tradition, and Creole families speaking a blend of French and English that outsiders often could not understand. It was a city defined by diversity but also by deep divisions. The late 19th century saw a surge of immigration, especially from Italy. Thousands of Sicilian families settled in Louisiana, drawn by work in sugarcane fields or opportunities in trade. Yet these immigrants, often poor and uneducated, faced hostility from the established population. They were stereotyped as criminals, accused of bringing secret societies like the mafia into the city. These tensions boiled over in 1891 with one of the darkest chapters in American history: the lynching of 11 Italian men after the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessy. Newspapers painted Italians as conspirators, tied to mysterious cults and underground orders. That stain lingered, and by the time of the Axeman's attacks 2 decades later, suspicion of secret immigrant societies was already deeply ingrained. Meanwhile, Louisiana was also a state haunted by its own religious and spiritual contradictions. Catholic churches dominated the skyline, their bells tolling above streets that also hosted hoodoo practitioners selling charms, candles, and potions. A rosary could be found hanging from one family's door, while just down the street another household kept gree-gree bags to ward off evil. In this environment, belief in the supernatural was not unusual, it was part of daily life. A violent crime was rarely seen as purely physical. People sought hidden meaning, curses, or rituals behind it. Poverty was another layer of the story. The turn of the century brought economic struggle, particularly for working-class families. Many lived in cramped wooden homes with thin walls and little protection against intruders. Doors were often left unlatched in the sweltering heat, windows propped open with sticks to invite a breeze. In such conditions, the idea that a killer could enter silently and leave without a trace was not just possible, it was terrifyingly easy. And when these killings began to follow patterns, targeting certain households and sparing others, suspicion turned toward explanations beyond chance. The newspapers of the time fueled this atmosphere. Sensational reporting was not new, but in Louisiana, it carried particular weight. Each new murder brought headlines dripping with horror, written to sell papers, but also to stoke fear. Editors speculated wildly about motives and culprits. Was the killer insane? Was he an immigrant laborer? Was he part of a ritualistic society demanding sacrifices? In a city already teeming with superstition, such words carried the power of prophecy. Ordinary readers began to see patterns where there may have been none, and rumors solidified into belief. One cannot ignore the racial context of the era. Louisiana, still reeling from Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation, was marked by deep divides between white and black communities. Violence was not uncommon, and law enforcement often ignored crimes against marginalized groups. Many of the Axeman's suspected victims were Italian grocers, a community already marked as outsiders by Anglo-Americans. That fact did not escape notice. To some, the killings seemed like targeted strikes, part revenge, part ritual. To others, they reinforced existing prejudices, casting Italians as participants in secret orders that invited doom upon themselves. Religion also shaped how people interpreted events. Preachers warned their congregations of sin, framing the murders as divine punishment or as the work of the devil walking in the flesh. Priests conducted special masses to bless neighborhoods, sprinkling holy water on doorways as frightened families clutched crosses. Spiritualists, meanwhile, claimed to feel the killer's aura, to sense the restless energy of a man channeling forces beyond himself. In homes lit by kerosene lamps, families debated whether prayer or charms offered better protection. Some even claimed to leave offerings of food or music, hoping to appease the killer's spirit, a reflection of the famous letter that would later be tied to the Axeman, suggesting he demanded jazz as tribute. All of this combined to create a city ready to believe not only in a murderer, but in a murderer with a purpose. The concept of occult connection did not arise in a vacuum. It was born of historical prejudice against immigrants, of sensational journalism, of genuine fear, and of a culture that blurred the line between the material and the spiritual. In a way, the people of Louisiana were predisposed to look for hidden meaning in the violence. Random brutality was unthinkable. Ritual murder, though terrifying, at least provided a framework, a story they could tell themselves in order to face the night. Beyond the city itself, the countryside of Louisiana and neighboring states carried its own weight of mystery. Swamps stretched into the distance, landscapes filled with moss-draped trees and the cries of unseen creatures. These places fed into folklore, spaces where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed thin. The swamp was both a sanctuary and a threat, a place criminals could vanish into and from which strange stories emerged. When people spoke of cult gatherings, of rituals performed under the moonlight, the swamp was the imagined backdrop. It represented everything unknowable and untamed about Louisiana life. To grasp why the cult theory stuck, one must also consider the failures of law enforcement at the time. Police forces were underfunded, often corrupt, and frequently more interested in protecting business interests than immigrant families. Each unsolved murder eroded trust. Communities began to believe that either the police were complicit in covering up the crimes or too weak to confront a force larger than themselves. In that void, rumor took the role of explanation. A cult could explain why the killer was never caught, why the crimes seemed unstoppable. The early 20th century was also a period when America wrestled with modernity. Science and medicine were advancing, but not fast enough to erase older beliefs. Psychology was a new and poorly understood field, criminology still in its infancy. People were just beginning to talk about criminal profiling, about the patterns of serial offenders. But to ordinary citizens, these ideas were abstract and inaccessible. Folk explanations, demons, curses, cults felt immediate and true. In this cauldron of superstition, prejudice, fear, and mystery, the Axeman's story took root. Each swing of his blade seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions, and each unanswered question added weight to the whispers that this was not the work of a lone man, but of a society hidden in the shadows, feeding on blood and fear. Louisiana was, in short, the perfect stage for a legend to grow. Its cultural crossroads, its uneasy relationship with crime, its spiritual contradictions, and its swampy, Gothic landscapes provided the soil in which myth and reality could entwine until they were indistinguishable. The Axeman walked not only the streets of New Orleans, but also the imagination of a people already primed to believe in cults, in curses, and in shadows that held power. The first whispers of terror did not erupt with a scream, but with silence. In 1911, a grocer and his wife were found in their small New Orleans shop, both struck down in their sleep. The weapon was not an exotic dagger, nor the product of elaborate ritual. It was an axe, taken from the victim's own home. The strangeness lay not only in the brutality, but in the pattern, doors left ajar without signs of forced entry, valuables untouched, and the eerie sense that the killer moved like a shadow, knowing exactly where his prey lay vulnerable. The police, fumbling for an explanation, called it robbery gone wrong, yet nothing was missing. Neighbors whispered of vendettas. Others saw the hand of something darker, something that moved not for profit, but for power. Months later, another family was struck. Again, the victims were grocers, Italian immigrants trying to build small lives on narrow streets lined with wooden houses. Again, the weapon was an axe, and again there was silence. The killer seemed to melt into the night, leaving behind only blood and questions. The newspapers began to connect dots, though clumsily. and the community began to murmur about a presence that was choosing its victims. The city's heat that summer was suffocating. Nights were spent with windows open, doors unlatched for any trace of a breeze. That very openness became a weakness. Families began to sleep uneasily, listening for the creak of a floorboard, the brush of a shadow. And then the pattern continued. A child crying in the night led a neighbor to discover yet another scene. The axe had fallen again, and the room bore no signs of struggle. It was as if the victims had never woken. Soon, the idea of a lone madman began to falter. These killings were too precise, too ritualistic in their repetition. Italians, particularly grocers, seemed disproportionately targeted. Was it personal revenge against a community? Or was it something more insidious, the hand of a secret order delivering punishment? The whisper of cult involvement spread, bolstered by the city's memory of mafia rumors and immigrant distrust. A strange twist emerged. In more than one case, the axe was left behind, propped against a wall or abandoned in the yard, as though deliberately staged. It was not the sign of haste, but of intent, an instrument used and discarded like a calling card. For those already inclined to superstition, this carried meaning. An axe was a tool, yes, but also a symbol of sacrifice, of division, of blood spilled to appease forces unseen. As the months bled into years, the killings became sporadic but unforgettable. Each one was covered with sensational headlines. The fiend returns. Murder demon stalks the streets. The axe strikes again. Citizens scanned each page for details, for patterns, for reassurance, yet the papers gave none. Instead, they magnified the fear. By 1918, the terror reached its peak. In one of the most infamous incidents, an entire family was attacked in their own beds, their cries waking neighbors who rushed to the scene too late. The horror spread faster than the police reports. Some claimed they saw a figure darting into the night, tall and faceless, moving with an unnatural swiftness. Others swore the killer had not run at all, but simply disappeared into the shadows, as though the darkness itself had swallowed him. Then came the letter. It arrived at the offices of a newspaper, written in a hand that seemed theatrical, almost mocking. The writer claimed to be not human at all, but a spirit, a demon of hell itself, declaring that more would die under his axe. He promised only one mercy, that on a particular night, any home where jazz music was played would be spared. Panic turned to frenzy. On that night, every dance hall was filled to bursting. Families hired musicians to play in their parlors. The city became a carnival of sound, a desperate attempt to drown out death with music. And true to the letter's promise, no one died. The cult theory gained traction like never before. Who but a group or something supernatural could orchestrate such a macabre game? To those who believed, the letter was not the work of a single man, but of a society demanding tribute. The connection between jazz, ritual, and survival became etched into the legend. Other incidents fed the growing dread. A young woman, struck but left alive, claimed she saw more than one shadow in her room that night. Police dismissed her testimony as delirium, but it whispered of accomplices, of a group rather than an individual. Another victim's relative swore that strange figures had been loitering near the family's home in the days before the attack. Men whose faces they could not place but whose presence was felt like a warning. Each crime seemed to blur the line between human and supernatural. Rational minds sought explanations. Perhaps the killer was a clever burglar who preyed on predictable weaknesses. Perhaps he was exploiting the distrust between police and immigrant communities to remain hidden. But for others, nothing rational could explain the relentlessness, the silence, the way the axe fell again and again without capture. The cult connection became the only story that made sense of the senseless. And through it all, the city lived in fear of the night. Parents put their children to bed with whispered prayers. Shopkeepers reinforced their doors with makeshift bars, though it seemed to do little good. Jazz musicians played with more urgency, their music now linked to survival itself. Families debated whether to flee the city, but most had nowhere to go. Instead, they endured, waiting for the next blow. The Axeman's reign was not endless. By 1919, the murders ceased as suddenly as they had begun. No arrest was ever made. No confession, no trial, no closure. The axe was set down, and the shadow that wielded it slipped away, leaving the city with unanswered questions. But the cult connection remained. Even decades later, older generations would tell the story not as a tale of one madman, but of a society, a pact, or a curse. The idea that the killer was merely human felt insufficient. In the collective memory of Louisiana, the Axeman was tied to something larger, something darker, something that outlived him. The incidents were not just murders. They became ritual, they became legend, and they became a mirror reflecting the fears, prejudices, and superstitions of a city already steeped in shadows. Fear is not a single emotion. It multiplies, it spreads, and it mutates into forms both rational and strange. In Louisiana during the years of the Axeman, fear became a way of life. At first, families responded in practical ways. Doors once left open to catch the breeze were now bolted and nailed shut. Shops reinforced their shutters. Axes, once left casually in yards or propped in kitchens, were hidden away as though the very sight of them could invite disaster. But beyond these gestures, there was little sense of safety. The killer did not steal valuables. He came for life itself. How do you defend against something so aimless, so arbitrary? For the Italian immigrant community, the reaction carried a deeper wound. Many victims were grocers of Italian descent, and soon rumors circulated that the Axeman's violence was not random, but targeted. Some believed the murders were revenge by a rival criminal group, perhaps connected to the mafia. Others whispered of debts unpaid or vendettas carried across the ocean. But as the killings spread beyond Italian families, that theory collapsed, leaving only a broader dread. Anyone could be next. Neighbors began to watch one another. Suspicion turned inward. If the killer could walk freely at night, perhaps he was not an outsider at all, but someone within the community. That idea poisoned friendships. Men eyed each other in marketplaces. Mothers hushed their children when a stranger passed by. Fear became isolation. Religious leaders tried to answer the panic. Catholic priests urged parishioners to stay strong, to see the killings not as punishment, but as a test of faith. They offered masses for the dead and processions for the living. Some Protestant ministers, however, took another tone, thundering from pulpits that the Axeman was the hand of divine justice, striking sinners down in their beds. Congregations left those sermons shaken, not comforted. The newspapers played their own part, feeding the hysteria. Each murder was splashed across headlines, described in lurid detail. Sketches of bloodied rooms and dramatic editorials painted the Axeman less as a man and more as a phantom. Reporters chased rumors, exaggerating connections, turning speculation into fact. Some writers openly embraced the cult theory, warning readers of secret societies and rituals hidden within the city's underbelly. Others dismissed such ideas but printed them anyway because fear sold papers. It was the newspapers that received the Axeman's infamous letter, and they chose to print it in full. In doing so, they handed him a stage larger than any courtroom. The killer or whoever claimed to be him spoke directly to the city, declaring himself a demon from hell, mocking the police, promising more blood. The effect was electric. To many, the letter confirmed what they already feared. This was not a man, but a force. To others, it was proof that a cult was orchestrating the terror, using the press as part of their performance. Ordinary citizens clung to strange forms of protection. Some sprinkled salt across thresholds. Others hung crucifixes above every doorway. Shopkeepers burned candles late into the night, believing the light itself would ward off evil. On the night the letter promised death to any home without jazz music, the city erupted into sound. Families hired small bands even if they could barely afford it. Pianos that had sat silent for years were dragged into use. Children were taught to hum melodies long into the night. The streets filled with music not for joy, but for survival. That collective act of fear transformed into a citywide ritual, a carnival of desperation. Psychologists of the era, though few in number, tried to interpret the hysteria. Some argued the Axeman was simply a lunatic exploiting superstition. Others believed he was feeding off the city's fear, turning panic into a weapon as powerful as his axe. Their essays were buried in journals few read, overshadowed by the bolder claims of reporters and preachers. But for ordinary people, explanations did not matter. The effect of the killings was enough. Children were taught never to sleep alone. Families moved in together, cramming into small houses for the comfort of numbers. Night watch groups formed, neighbors taking turns patrolling the streets with lanterns and rifles. Yet even those efforts carried little weight. The axeman struck where he pleased, untouched by vigilance. As the killings dragged on, a kind of exhaustion set in. Fear that once felt sharp and immediate became dull, ever-present, like humidity in the Louisiana summer. People grew used to living in dread. They carried on with their lives, working, shopping, worshiping, while always glancing at the shadows, always listening for the creak of a floorboard. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The murders stopped. The axeman vanished. No arrest, no trial, no justice. Only silence. The reactions of the people did not fade so easily. For decades afterward, old-timers would tell stories of the terror. Some swore the axeman had been a man who fled the city. Others insisted he was never human at all, but a demon that retreated only when his appetite was sated. In immigrant households, the story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that safety could never be taken for granted. The newspapers eventually moved on. Priests turned to other sermons. But within families, the fear lingered. Children who grew up during the reign of the axeman carried the memory with them into adulthood. They taught their own children to lock doors, to mistrust shadows, to understand that sometimes evil does not announce itself. It simply slips into your home at night. The reactions of society were as much a part of the story as the killings themselves. They transformed a series of murders into legend. Without the fear, the suspicion, the music, the rituals, the axeman might have been remembered as just another killer. Instead, he became something larger, a ghost in the collective memory of Louisiana, a symbol of dread that blurred the line between man and myth. The night that would become legend began like any other, with the air heavy and the streets restless under a moon that seemed too pale for comfort. Louisiana in the early 1910s was alive with contradictions, music spilling from taverns, the distant chime of bells from late-night services, the creak of shutters in the breeze. But beneath it all was a silence that pressed into the hearts of every household. The axeman had promised to walk again. By then, people knew the rhythm of his terror. They had studied his pattern, though it never made sense. He chose families at random, spared valuables, and struck in silence. The only constants were his weapon and his certainty. The axe was always near at hand, sometimes belonging to the family themselves, as if he wanted to remind them that death was already within their walls, waiting. And his certainty, his ability to vanish into the night with no trace, was the part that unsettled even the most practical minds. On this particular night, the city itself felt like a stage set for disaster. Windows glowed with lantern light, but curtains were drawn tight. The scent of candles mixed with the aroma of strong coffee, brewed to keep entire families awake. In the Italian quarter, violins and pianos rattled in defiance, jazz melodies crashing into the darkness with desperate insistence. It was the night after his letter had appeared in the newspapers, the one in which he declared himself not a man but a spirit of hell, and demanded that music flood the city or he would claim more lives. And so the music came. Whole neighborhoods became orchestras, some households scraping together coins to hire a single fiddler, others relying on weary hands pounding at battered keys. To anyone passing through the streets, the sound would have been haunting a discordant symphony, stitched together by fear. Mothers swayed with their children, pretending the songs were for joy, while their eyes never left the locked doors. Fathers sat with shotguns on their knees, praying silently that bullets could stop whatever creature haunted them. The axeman did not strike that night. Instead, he let the city play itself raw, let fear turn into frenzy. And when the dawn came, with no bodies found, some laughed with relief, while others shuddered at the thought that they had bargained with something unholy and survived. But survival was only temporary. Weeks later, the silence of the city returned, and with it, the axe. It happened in a quiet home on the edge of the city, a place that had felt safe in its distance from the heart of New Orleans. The family was ordinary, unremarkable people who believed that evil belonged to the headlines, not their doorstep. Yet in the small hours of morning, neighbors awoke to the sound of splintering wood, a scream cut short, and then nothing but the steady thud of metal striking flesh. When help arrived, the scene was chaos. The walls bore the mark of struggle. The smell of blood filled the narrow rooms, and the family, once whole, was left broken in silence. An axe lay discarded on the floor, as it always did, like a calling card. Nothing was stolen. Bread sat untouched on the counter. Coins remained in purses. Only life had been taken, swiftly and with merciless precision. The witnesses spoke of shadows in the street, of a figure moving too quickly to follow. Some swore they heard laughter, faint and drifting like smoke. Others insisted they saw nothing at all, that the night had swallowed the killer whole. What united them all was terror. If the city had been on edge before, now it was unraveling. The newspapers erupted. Headlines screamed of the Axeman's return, louder and more fevered than ever. Reporters described the home as if it were an altar, the crime as ritual sacrifice. They reminded readers of the cult rumors, whispers of secret societies practicing rites in the swamps, of offerings demanded by spirits older than the city itself. The killer's silence had allowed imagination to run wild, and the murder scene seemed to confirm every superstition. The clergy redoubled their sermons. Some framed the killing as a punishment for doubting the warnings. Others declared the Axeman proof that the devil walked freely among men. Yet no sermon could calm the public. Families clutched their children tighter, refusing to let them out even in daylight. Men patrolled the streets with lanterns and clubs, but they too felt powerless. Then came the moment that cemented the Axeman, not just as a murderer, but as legend. A survivor. In one household, he struck as before, door splintered, screams cut short, but one victim clung stubbornly to life. Though grievously injured, they managed to describe fragments. A towering figure, face shadowed, movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Yet when pressed, their words shifted. Sometimes they claimed to see eyes glowing like coals. Other times they swore he wore a black hat and cloak like an old preacher. The inconsistencies only deepened the mystery. Doctors called it trauma. Reporters called it proof of the supernatural. Neighbors whispered that the survivor had glimpsed something not meant for mortal eyes.
And in this muddle of fear, the cult theory flourished.
The Axeman was no longer a man alone. He was thought to be part of a secret brotherhood, bound by blood and ritual, striking not for greed but for devotion. The climax of his reign was not one single murder, but the crescendo of dread, the way the city itself seemed to break under his presence. People could not agree on who he was, but they all agreed on one thing: he was everywhere. Every sound in the night could be him. Every shadow could hide his axe. The city itself became his accomplice, its fear magnifying his legend. And then, as always, he vanished again. The last killing left a scar deeper than blood. The community no longer asked when he would return, but why he chose to leave. Did he tire of his ritual? Did he move on to another city, another flock of victims? Or had he taken what he came for, completing some unseen covenant? In that final silence, Louisiana was left with no closure. Only the echoes of footsteps in the night and the lingering thought that at any moment, the Axeman or something like him could return. When the killing ceased, Louisiana did not exhale relief so much as it collapsed into uneasy silence. The absence of the Axeman was not a victory. It was an unanswered question, suspended in the air like the last note of a dirge. People carried on with their lives because they had to, because bread still had to be baked, children still had to be fed, fields still had to be worked, but beneath every daily rhythm was the knowledge that the terror had not ended. It had only disappeared. The city changed in subtle ways. Doors that once stood open to catch the river breeze were now reinforced, bolted, guarded with heavy locks. Families who once gathered on porches at night retreated indoors, their laughter replaced with whispers. Musicians still filled the air with jazz, but even their melodies seemed to carry an edge of defiance, as if daring the darkness to return. Fear had not destroyed New Orleans, but it had marked it, and the mark lingered. The newspapers, once ravenous for the Axeman's blood-soaked headlines, eventually turned their attention elsewhere. Politics, labor strikes, storms on the Gulf, they all pushed the murderer's name to smaller and smaller columns. Yet the silence did not erase him. In fact, it magnified him. Stories retold in kitchens and taverns grew more vivid with each passing year. The Axeman became more than a man. He became folklore, his image shifting with each retelling. For some, he was a vengeful ghost, striking at families who had offended some forgotten spirit. For others, he was the hand of a cult, carrying out rituals that fed on blood and terror. Some swore he was simply a maniac, a predator with no purpose beyond cruelty. But in every version, the fear remained the same. Historians later searched for logic. They sifted through police reports, court records, witness testimonies. They pointed to the violence of the age, the poverty, the corruption, the desperation that fed both crime and rumor. They spoke of the rise of sensationalist journalism, how newspapers spun tales into nightmares because terror sold more copies than truth. And yet, even the most rational voices admitted something deeper lingered. The facts of the case did not close the wound. The shadows refused to stay in the past. Perhaps the most haunting part of the Axeman's legacy was not the murders themselves, but the way people remembered them. Generations later, children were still warned to behave, or the Axeman will come. Families carried their own versions of the story, polished and sharpened with each telling, until the killer was no longer a man at all, but a figure of myth, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and chaos. Some folklorists compared him to other specters of American darkness, the Headless Horseman, Bloody Mary, tales that slipped between superstition and history. But unlike them, the Axeman was rooted in blood and bone. His crimes were real, his victims were real. That weight made him more terrible than any ghost story whispered in the dark. In recent years, scholars and writers have revisited the case with new tools: psychological analysis, criminology, cultural theory. They ask whether the Axeman's letter was a hoax, whether his cult connection was nothing more than hysteria layered over tragedy. Some suggest multiple killers acted under one name, their deeds blurred together by frightened imaginations. Others wonder if the Axeman himself fed those rumors, deliberately cultivating the sense that he was more than human, because fear was the sharpest weapon of all. But the truth has never been found. No arrest was made, no confession written, no closure granted. The Axeman walked into the shadows and never returned. That is why his story lingers, not because of what is known, but because of what is not. Even today, if you walk the streets of New Orleans late at night, you may hear echoes of that era. A sudden silence in the music, a shadow slipping between alleys, the creak of shutters on an old house. The city itself seems to hold the memory, as if unwilling to let go. Some swear the legend still breathes, that the cult whispers were not just hysteria, but fragments of a truth too unsettling to face. Others believe the Axeman has become something more enduring than flesh and blood, a symbol of dread, of the violence humans are capable of, and of the way fear itself can possess a city. In the end, the Axeman's story is not just about murder. It is about how people endure the unknowable. It is about a society that tried to explain horror with sermons, science, and superstition, and failed. It is about the weight of mystery, heavier than any blade, and so his legacy persists. A figure half man, half shadow, walking forever between fact and folklore. The Axeman of Louisiana remains less a chapter of history than a ghostly refrain, a melody that never resolves, a silence that never truly ends. The final question is the one that still unsettles. What was he? A man driven by cruelty? A collective illusion born of fear? A fragment of something darker than humanity? We cannot say. All we know is that he came, he struck, and he left a scar that has never healed. Perhaps that is the most frightening truth of all, that some horrors do not end. They linger, reshaping themselves with every retelling, finding new ways to haunt us. And as long as people whisper his name, the Axeman will never truly be gone.